February 1899. Felix IV is dead, and the right-wing coup has been quashed. A new president takes his seat, Émile Bréhier. The Dreyfus case is reopened by the Supreme Court, but the military judges, still on the side with the anti-Dreyfusards, refuse to allow any new evidence. Dreyfus is immediately found guilty a second time. When the affair erupted, Anatole France was not a marginal figure. He was a national voice, calm, respected, and widely read. He watched with growing alarm as anti-Semitism spread, as the army demanded blind loyalty and the press descended into hysteria. He saw in the affair a parable of human folly, how easily a nation could be led astray by prejudice and fear. France's reaction was not explosive like Zola's, nor philosophical like Jaurès. It was measured, elegant, and devastating. His essays dismantled the army's arguments with quiet precision. He reminded readers that justice was not a matter of national pride, but of moral duty. This is Metro Stop Podcast, and I'm your host, Kelly Blair. Anatole France is a station on Line 3, opened on the 24th of September 1937. It's located outside of central Paris in the northwest. Anatole France was born François Anatole Thibault on April 16th, 1844. His father owned a bookshop on Quai Voltaire in Paris, specialising in rare and academic works. This was not a typical childhood. He grew up surrounded by manuscripts, historians, poets, and political thinkers. From an early age, France absorbed humanism, scepticism, a respect for reason, a dislike of fanaticism. Anatole France wrote, "I only had to cross the Seine to reach the Louvre. My youth was nourished in a splendid palace." France studied at the College Stanislas, a Catholic school, but he never embraced religious dogma. He became a literary critic in the 1860s and the 1870s, known for clarity and moderation rather than polemic. He also worked as a librarian in the Senate Library, a position that placed him at the heart of the Republic's intellectual life, but he was not a political activist. He was a careful observer of French society, with a strong sense of justice and a deep suspicion of extremism. He believed that truth was fragile and institutions were fallible, and that justice required vigilance. Anatole France is one of the first, but quietest of the Dreyfusards. He isn't a political operator like Clemenceau, he isn't a firebrand like Zola, and he isn't a philosophical socialist like Jaurès, and he certainly isn't a president trying to contain a crisis like Felix IV. He is something else. A moral authority whose voice helped legitimise the Dreyfusard cause among moderate, educated Republicans. By the 1890s, Anatole France was one of the most respected writers in France. His key works included The Crime de Sylvestre Bonnard in 1881, Thiers in 1890, and La Rôtisserie de la Reine Pédoc in 1893. These novels were already rehearsing the moral instincts that would define him. In Le Crime de Sylvestre Bonnard, he gives us a gentle scholar who breaks the law to save a child, an early declaration that compassion outranks authority. In Thiers, he dismantles religious fanaticism through the story of a monk undone by his own zeal, exposing the dangers of moral absolutism. And in La Rôtisserie de la Reine Pédoc, France turns to satire, mocking superstition and intellectual pretension through a playful, enlightenment-infused tale. Taken together, these works sketch the outline of a writer who distrusted dogma, defended the vulnerable, and believed that reason and humanity must prevail over institutions. In 1896, he was elected to the Académie Française, the highest literary honour in the country. During the most intense years of the affair, France spoke at public meetings and wrote essays defending Dreyfus, and he signed Zola's open letter in support. He condemned the manipulation of evidence and the anti-Semitic press and the cowardice of the government. Most importantly, he used his Académie Française prestige to counter anti-Semitic propaganda and help shift educated middle-class opinion towards the Dreyfusards' side. He was not the loudest voice, but he was one of the most credible. His role was to reassure, not to provoke. He gave the Dreyfusard movement legitimacy, intellectual credibility, a calm, reasoned voice, and a bridge to moderate Republicans. In 1899, at the retrial, France spoke publicly, arguing that the Republic itself is on trial and justice must be done, even if it meant humiliation for the army. Then, in 1899, Alfred Dreyfus is pardoned, but not exonerated. Ford's replacement offered a compromise, a pardon for Alfred and an amnesty on everyone else involved. The Dreyfusards were not keen on this option, as accepting a pardon you could be seen as admitting guilt, and the amnesty meant that the military would not be held accountable, and it killed any possibility of reform. But by this time, public opinion had swung dramatically in favour of Dreyfus, and Alfred himself, having been humiliated and scapegoated, and having spent years alone on a malaria-infested island, he wanted to go home to his family. But the affair would not be officially over until July 1906, when the Supreme Court overturned the conviction. Anatole France lived long enough to see the Dreyfus affair fade from headlines and settle into the deeper layers of France's conscience. And he lived long enough to see himself transformed from a controversial public intellectual into a national monument. But he was never simple, never universally embraced. After the affair, his fame only grew. His novels, essays and critiques made him one of the most recognisable voices of the Third Republic. In 1921, he received the Nobel Prize in Literature, celebrated for the elegance of his prose and the depth of his human sympathy. But even at the height of his acclaim, he remained a divisive figure. The Catholic Church banned several of his books, condemning them as corrosive to faith and morality. Critics on the right dismissed him as dangerously soft, a sentimentalist who believed too much in human goodness. Even some on the left found him to be naive, too gentle, for a century that was hardening around him. But Anatole France never apologised for his tenderness. He spent years writing, mentoring young writers, and speaking out against injustices, colonial abuses, social inequality, and the rising tide of nationalism. When Anatole France died in 1924, the funeral procession stretched through Paris. Tens of thousands lined the streets. Some came for the writer, some came for the humanist, some came because they remembered the affair and the courage it took to speak when silence was easier. He was buried in Neuilly-sur-Seine. In the decades that followed, his name appeared on schools, libraries, boulevards, and finally on a metro station, not because he was a politician or a general, but because he insisted France could be better than its fears. In his speech, Gabriel Hanotaux, director of the Académie Française, said, "Paris has its manners, its philosophy, its tastes, as it has its language. Paris is never astonished, nor taken by surprise. Its self-possession comes from a surprising sincerity, no pedantry, no hypocrisy, simplicity and rightness. If I had to name these Parisian virtues, I would say Anatole France." His life was not defined by the Dreyfus affair, but the affair revealed Anatole France was a man who believed that justice was not the work of courts alone, but of every citizen who refused to look away. By the time Alfred Dreyfus was finally exonerated in 1906, France was no longer the country that had condemned him. The affair had forced the Republic to confront its own institutions, the army, the courts, the press, the church. It was a national reckoning. It left marks that would shape the century. The years that followed brought profound change. In 1905, France passed a law separating church and state, ending a century of clerical influence over public life. It was not written because of the Dreyfus affair, but the affair made it unavoidable. The country had seen what happened when institutions claimed infallibility. The Republic chose secularism not as an ideology, but as a safeguard. Internationally, the affair had consequences that no one could have predicted. A young journalist named Theodore Herz, covering the trial in Paris, watched the crowd scream death to Jews and concluded that assimilation would never protect Europe's Jews. Out of that realisation came the early foundations of Zionism, a movement that would reshape global history. And what of the 5 men whose names now appear on the Paris metro? Clemenceau, he fought for a republic strong enough to correct its own errors. Zola fought for the truth spoken plainly no matter the cost. Jaurès fought for justice rooted in democracy and human dignity. He fought for stability even when it meant looking away. And Anatole France fought for reason, for humanity. Each man saw the affair through his own lens. Each man asked different questions. While each man did condemn anti-Semitism, why was it not at the centre of their fight? Well, the answer is not really that simple. For many Dreyfusards, the affair was about the Republic, not about the Jews. The affair was not seen as a Jewish issue, it was seen as a national issue. They believed that if this could happen to Dreyfus, it could happen to anyone. This universal framing helped build a broad coalition appealing to moderates who might not have been moved by a purely anti-Semitic argument. But it also meant the specific danger of anti-Semitism was not fully confronted. It would return in the 1930s under Vichy with devastating consequences. They defended Dreyfus because the state had lied. They fought the injustice, but not always the prejudice that made it possible. Their silence revealed the limits of political courage in a country still hanging on to its old fears. The Republic survived riots, the trials, the forged documents, the street violence, the attempted coup after Félix Faux's death. It survived because enough people, writers, politicians, citizens, refused to accept a lie as the foundation of their nation. As for Alfred Dreyfus himself, his story did not end with his pardon. He returned to the army that had betrayed him. He fought in the First World War for a country that had once called him a traitor. He served with dignity, quietly, without bitterness. When he died in 1935, France was again drifting towards the shadows of nationalism. But the affair remained a warning, a reminder of how fragile justice can be and how much vigilance it requires. The Dreyfus affair was a test of institutions, of citizens, of the Republic itself, and the Republic passed, not perfectly, not proudly, but decisively enough to survive. The affair did not make France just, but it made France more aware of what justice demands. And that, in the end, is the affair's legacy. This has been Metro Stop Podcast. My main source for the Dreyfus affair was a video by Sam Aronow. Biographies are from Britannica, and I've listed all other sources in the show notes. Music by Alex Productions.